Welcome. My name is John Seiler. I am a fellow at the NAS, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. It's a part of an ongoing series titled Right Ideas, where we explore thinkers who are conservative or who have had influence on the conservative movement and conservative thought. Today, we'll be discussing the ideas and legacy of Robert Nisbet. Nisbet was a sociologist, a conservative thinker, and an author of a dozen books over the course of his long career, including The Quest for Community, The Sociological Tradition, and Conservatism, Dream and Reality. A little bit about the format of this event. After I introduce our speakers, they will each have 12 to 14 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. So please, at any time, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I'll be sure to monitor that closely so that your questions can be asked and answered by our distinguished panelists. Speaking of those distinguished panelists, I'll go ahead and give a brief introduction of each. Luke Sheahan is an assistant professor of political science at Duquesne University and editor of the University Bookman. Brad Berzer is professor of history and Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College. And Sam Goldman is associate professor of political science at George Washington University and literary editor of Modern Age. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Sheahan.
Hello, thank you, John. And thank you to the National Association of Scholars for sponsoring this and to all of you for attending. So Robert Alexander Nisbet, I'm going to give a brief introduction to his bio, and then I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of a particular aspect of his thought. So Nisbet was one of the most prominent sociologists and public commentators of the 20th century. He made significant contributions to the study of the history of sociology, political theory, and the American intellectual conservative movement and the post-war period. He was a self-described philosophical conservative. And he's a little hard to categorize politically. He was close friends with Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk actually added him. Russell Kirk's great book, The Conservative Mind, came out in 1953, the same year as Nisbet's first and most famous book, The Quest for Community. And in later editions of The Conservative Mind, Russell Kirk includes Nisbet in that book. And he also anthologizes Nisbet among conservative thinkers in some of his other edited volumes. Nisbet's a little hard to categorize politically. He was very critical of Reagan's foreign policy, as well as every president in the 20th century. But he fits in well with intellectual conservatism. And you'll see why when you hear all of our talks today of how exactly it is that he situated himself and what his contributions were. He made very important contributions to sociology. He authored some important textbooks I'll talk about very briefly. The real impetus for Nisbet's work was what he saw as rising alienation. So he thought that Western peoples and many Eastern peoples were experiencing alienation from the world around them. So they were feeling more and more disconnected from the world around them. We'll talk about some of the causes of that. And he would recognize what we call the loneliness epidemic today, or the effects of the smartphone on mental health and isolation and that sort of thing. He'd recognize all of these trends as early as 1953. Sometimes he's very prescient in things he has to say in Quest for Community. It's almost like he's reading a commentary on the effects of Facebook rather than a commentary on the effects of television and some of what he has to say in that book. So Nisbet starts off in 1913, where he's born in Los Angeles. He attends the University of California at Berkeley. He receives all of his degrees there, finishing in 1939. And he studied under Frederick J. Taggart, a very interesting guy who had a huge influence upon his thinking in all sorts of areas. Nisbet publishes his first book in 1953, The Quest for Community. And that year, he also takes a deanship in the new campus at Riverside. And he spends about a decade as a dean. He does academic work. He's still involved in it, but he doesn't really hit the ground running with his academic work until 1963. So he's 50 years old. And in the meantime, he held some visiting positions at Princeton, a place in Italy, the University of Arizona, and other places. And he would conclude his career as the Albert Schweitzer Chair at Columbia University, a very prestigious position that he held from 1974 to 1978. So he was at the very center of academia in terms of his prestige. He would go on to deliver the Jefferson Lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1987. That is the highest award awarded in the humanities by the federal government. So he's at the very, very pinnacle of the academic world in a way that a lot of conservatives in the 20th century were kind of marginal in that sense. Russell Kirk left his academic position very early. So he became famous, but it was for other reasons. He wasn't in academia. Nisbet was. He was very much at the center of academia, and that was unusual for those intellectuals. Now, I want to just give you a rundown of his productivity. He publishes his first book in 1953. He goes back to teaching full-time and writing full-time in 1963. And here's his rundown of his books. Emile Durkheim, 1965. The Sociological Tradition, 1966. Tradition and Revolt, 1968. Social Change in History, 1969. The Social Bond, 1970. The Degradation of Academic Dogma, 1971. The Social Philosophers, 1973. And a lot of these are massive 400-page books, very dense. The Sociology of Emile Durkheim, 1974, Twilight of Authority, 1975, Sociology as an Art Form, 1976, History of the Idea of Progress, 1980, Prejudices, A Philosophical Dictionary, 1984, Conservatism, Dream and Reality, 1986, The Making of Modern Society, 1986, The Present Age, 1988, Roosevelt and Stalin, The Failed Courtship, 1988, Teachers and Scholars, and Memoir of Berkeley and Depression and War, 1992. So that's insane productivity. And all these books, I've read all of them, and they're all quite good. There's some overlap, of course, in the themes, but there's also insights that can be gleaned in each one of them uniquely. Now, there are two major themes in Nisbet's thought. The first is the study of the conflict between the state and the social group. And Sam and Brad's talks are going to fit into that category. And his second main area is his critique of what he called developmentalism. I'm going to talk about that right now. So developmentalism for Nisbet, and he writes a number of books on this theme, although it's not the dominant theme in his work. The idea of developmentalism is the application of the concept of organic growth to social change. So institutions develop over time according to an inner design, a sort of institutional DNA, you might say, such that the later forms of the social organization always derive their origins from the earlier forms. So social change is directional, cumulative, irreversible, purposeful, and caused by forces endogenous, that is internal to the society. He actually gets this theme from Taggart, his dissertation advisor, who wrote several books on this in the early 20th century that ended up being quite brilliant in their critique of this way of thinking. Now, this idea of developmentalism, it's hard to wrap your mind around exactly what he's getting at. Once you get it, you can't unsee it. You start seeing it in everywhere. He believed it would kind of suffused Western thought for 2,500 years or more, and how we think. We in the West broadly think about virtually everything. And once you kind of understand what he's getting at, you see it everywhere. And we'll talk a little bit about problems he saw with this way of thinking, but also promises. So first, development is directional. So this means we often talk of civilizational growth. So there's always this trend, a longitudinal shape, you might say, moving from one point to another. You can plot it. We can talk about the history of civilizations. We can plot points as they rise. That language I just used, the rise and fall of civilizations, that's directional. The development is cumulative. So the growth we see is accumulation of changes that accumulate slowly over time. So from a simple to complex, usually. And every stage of development is the inevitable one of what has come before. Third, development is irreversible. You don't get to go backwards. So a big part of the idea of developmentalism is the biological metaphor. So we talk about social organizations, civilizations, countries, especially nations, in terms of biological metaphor. So the childhood of a civilization, and then the manhood of a civilization, the old age of a civilization, follows this arc, and it's the same arc as biological organisms. So changes are irreversible. Once you reach old age, you don't go backwards. Once you leave childhood, you don't go backwards to childhood again. That's the idea. And civilizations are the same way. That's what Nisbet's describing. And he's critiquing that understanding. Civilizations are the same way. Nations are the same way. And then fourth, there's an end towards which society is developing or a social institution is developing. Growth always has a purpose, adulthood, and then arcs towards adulthood, and then it declines again. Now, this trajectory that I've described, these stages of development, the biological metaphor, it exists in pagan thought, Christian thought, it can be materialist, it's in Marxist thought, it's all over. That's not the point, is what the particular details are. It's that structure of thinking and describing civilizations and societies that Nisbet finds a little suspect. We find it in Aristotle. So Aristotle describes the rise of the polis, starts as a family, which turns into a village, which then turns into the polis eventually. So there's a direction. The family has in it the seeds to become the polis someday. Given enough time, given enough development, it'll reach that. And it's irreversible in the sense that you go towards the polis, you're not going to go back. Society's not going to go back to just being the kinship group. It's not how it works. The trajectory is kind of unilateral, unilinear for Aristotle. It's in one direction and it's irreversible. So this organic metaphor shows up all the time. The idea of we have a healthy or sick society, an aging society, an advancing society, or a decaying society. To use modern terms, progress and decline. Both of these are developmental metaphors. So the biological metaphor is really key. And you'll find it in the Greeks, so the first to really make use of this. You see it in Hesiod, you see it in Plato, Aristotle, and the Greeks use the term physis, so the growth of organic life, and they bring it there. The Christians pick up on it. So St. Augustine and this idea of the linear conception of Christian history. He talks about the human race as being kind of in a uniform series of development. And of course, the kind of driving force here is God's plan of salvation as it plays out through history, but it's unilinear development. You don't go backwards. God's plan is moving forward towards salvation. Now, Augustine introduces some ideas. One is historical necessity. This is God's will that is being worked out. It's necessary that history moves in this direction. By divine necessity, historical necessity. And the driving force is conflict. There's a conflict, a tension between the two cities, the city of God and the city of man in Augustine. There's conflict and it moves this progress forward. You see those elements, those main elements in Augustine, for the next 1,500 years. They kind of suffuse our ideas of not just Christian medieval ideas, but modern ideas of how progress works and developmentalism in that sense. So think of the modern idea of progress. There's direction, improvement, continuous improvement. It's accumulative. Knowledge and technological advances take place in stages, and we describe these: industrial revolution, information revolution, or the information age, industrial age, agricultural age. These are stages of development. They're irreversible. Once you go to the next one, you don't go back. When you become part of the developed world, you don't become undeveloped. And there's a purpose to our idea of progress, this moral and material improvements of the human race. Herbert Spencer called progress the beneficent necessity. Sounds very similar to the divine necessity of Augustine. So these elements of this progressive idea, and Augustine would refer to civilizations or societies aging just like a man does, going through a stage just like a man does. And he sees Rome as entering into old man stage. It's becoming elderly. So this idea of the biological metaphor, the problem Nisbet has with it is not that it can't reveal things. Metaphors can help us see things, but they can also be confused for the thing itself. So society is not a biological organism. It's a social organism. So why would it be bound by laws of biological development? Like, we are biological organisms. That's as true of us. We grow old and we go from childhood to young adulthood to mature adulthood to old age. Yes, we all do this. The acorn starts as an acorn, and within it is the potential to be a full-grown oak tree. And you put it in the ground, you grow it, it goes through the stages, it becomes a sapling, and then a full-grown tree, then a mature tree, gets bigger, and so on. It has a trajectory. But why would that be necessary to a social organism, a society, a country? It's not the same as a biological organism. So his problem with this metaphor is not that it can be helpful. It can be helpful in some circumstances, but it can also obscure because you get the sense when you read these thinkers throughout the millennia, they start confusing and conflating the two. They very much believe the social organism abides by the laws that govern biological organisms. So confusing the metaphor with the real thing. So that's his big critique of this way of thinking, and why he thinks it can obscure the way what we're actually seeing in society. It does this in a couple of ways. One of the main ones is it becomes what you might say is circular reasoning. So some thinkers, Talcott Parsons, for example, who develops this scheme of kind of a tripartite scheme of development. You kind of have what's he call them? I think pre-modern or primitive societies, and then kind of pre-modern and modern societies. Well, when he was researching that, he had a big cabinet with 3 categories. And every time he was doing his research, he'd stick cards into one of those 3 categories. Well, he assumed the categories at the outset, and then he found evidence as he studied through societies of that. But if you notice that we have societies today that we call developed and undeveloped at the same time, we have hunter-gatherer societies that still exist. So to kind of put them in this line of development is to play a little fast and loose with the actual historical facts. That's his concern, is you can end up forcing historical facts into a narrative and miss what really happens. The alternative view he has is you want to pay attention to the fact of fixity. So societies will often be the same, almost the same for a long period of time until something happens. There's an event, there's an invasion, a meteor hits. That's what happens to the dinosaurs. There's an invasion, there's a pandemic. That changes things. A disease changed things. So do you say, well, this society kind of crumbled because of it went to old age, or was there a pandemic? So Taggart writes this great book on Rome and China way back in like the 1920s. And he kind of points out that everyone is saying Rome goes through this kind of life cycle. It's a young civilization that rises, and then it starts to fall into old age. And then it's conquered. Well, maybe, but here's the thing. There was all these events going on in China and Rome at the same time that were causing migration patterns to shift, so that such that people were migrating westward, and then they end up pressing upon the Germans who are upon the borders of Rome. The Germans go into Roman borders. Lots of events going on all over the world. Don't just force this one kind of understanding of development onto Roman civilization. Pay attention to historical happenings going on all over the world, and pay attention to these intrusions from outside of Rome that might have affected its health and development and the happenings there. And Nisbet's thought in this regard bears some resemblance to the contemporary social thinker Nassim Taleb, who writes a very famous book, The Black Swan. That's what Nisbet's kind of referring to, is black swan events. So, what happens, what really causes change? Can we just have it all figured out with our theories of history, or are there black swan events? Something just happens. Some crazy guys fly planes into a building on September 11th, 2001. That changes things. So we can give our kind of political theory of American development, but you can't change these massive historical events that really affect things. And that's what Nisbet's getting at. And that's his critique of this idea of developmentalism. And as you can see, it's a very complicated concept that he's going after. But once you kind of get it, he's saying basically anticipating Nassim Taleb's work in 2007, and a little earlier and a little later on these issues, except he was writing this in the 1960s. So he was very much ahead of the curve and seeing problems with this way of thinking.
Thanks so much, Luke. As a reminder, if you have questions at any point when any of our speakers are giving their presentations, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. I'll make sure to monitor both of those. Up next, we have Brad.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And Marina behind the scenes, thank you both. Thanks to the NAS for having me speak. Huge thanks to Luke and to Sam. I've met Luke several times and consider him a very good friend and ally. I've never actually had the privilege of meeting Sam, but I consider him an ally as well. And certainly he's been very friendly on social media, which, as you know, is not always the norm on social media. So I'm very glad that we've been allies on that. I have to thank a person who's not involved in this directly, but a Spanish scholar who was here this past summer, Lucia Vallejo. I don't know if she's actually on this chat or not today on this webinar, but she was very foundational in shaping some of my own ideas on Nisbet through our various conversations we had over the summer. So I've been interested in Nisbet for a very long time. I became interested in Nisbet way back in college. I'm 55 now, so this was back in the late 1980s. I graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 1990, but I became very interested in Nisbet my junior and senior year of college, especially as the Berlin Wall was coming down. And I was interested in libertarianism. I was interested in conservatism. And at that point, The Present Age came out, which had a huge influence on me as a young person then and a young scholar. And I was very taken with Nisbet's understanding of what the state is. And I personally have always been somewhere in between a conservative and a libertarian. I'm not that political as a person, but certainly in my own political theory, I've been involved somewhere between, say, Kirk and Nisbet and Hayek. And it's interesting to me that if you look at someone like Robert Nisbet, who, as Luke very, very nicely said, published his great book, The Quest for Community, in 1953, the same year that Russell Kirk published The Conservative Mind. It's also the same year that Leo Strauss published Natural Right and History. It's the same year that Ray Bradbury published Fahrenheit 451. There were a number of books coming out at that time. 1953 was really an annus mirabilis for anyone who wasn't on the left, considering all of these great books that were coming out. But what makes Nisbet stand out is how utterly defiant he is of the idea of the state and what the state is, capital S, this idea of a governing political body which interferes with our own social communities. And so, not surprisingly, he looks to people like Edmund Burke, and he looks to Alexis de Tocqueville, and he looks to others as he's trying to figure out what the state is. And one of the things that I'd like to note, especially at the beginning of my talk, is that if you look at someone like Robert Nisbet, he's as radical as someone, say, like Murray Rothbard, in terms of libertarianism. Even though Nisbet is not a libertarian, he's a conservative, he's as radical on his understanding of the state as most extreme libertarians are. And I found that fascinating, that even though he doesn't identify at all with libertarianism, he is incredibly critical of the state. And you see how powerful the state is. So if we go back, just a couple of quotes from 1953 from The Quest for Community. In the preface to the first edition, Nisbet says, "I believe the single greatest influence upon social organization in the modern West has been the developing concentration on function and power of the sovereign political capital S state. To regard the state as simply a legal relationship, as a mere superstructure of power, is profoundly delusive. The real significance of the modern state is inseparable from its successive penetrations of man's economic, religious, kinship, and local allegiances, and its revolutionary dislocations of established centers of function and authority." So the state itself is a revolution, as Nisbet sees it. It is this modern harbinger towards all of these radical changes that are coming about in society. Nisbet had written that originally in December of 1952 for his 1953 book, The Quest for Community. But if we jump forward a little bit, in that same book, he tells us, and in my version here, The Quest for Community, this is on page 44, he says, "Quite apart from the innumerable agencies of private welfare, the whole tendency of modern political development has been to enhance the role of the political state as a direct relationship among individuals, and to bring both its powers and its services more intimately into the lives of human beings." So, as Edmund Burke very famously said, when we create our social organisms, when we create our social organizations, we do this as little platoons. So we have mother and father, we have family, we have our local associations of club and society or school, and our religious organizations. All of these things are natural functions of the human condition that we associate one with another. As de Tocqueville says in Democracy in America, the right to association is the single most important right that exists, this ability for us to work one with another. But the political sphere for Nisbet keeps expanding and expanding. And it's a little bit different. I would agree completely with Luke and his understanding of developmentalism, but there's a bit of a difference between the modern political state and, say, the Persian state under Xerxes or Darius. And even though there's a continuity, the state is always for Nisbet this euphemism, this thing that is trying to outmaneuver and outrun us at all times. The modern state for Nisbet, along with other thinkers like Christopher Dawson or Russell Kirk, the modern state has taken on a religious function as well. And therefore, it doesn't just presume to run things temporal, it presumes to run things spiritual as well. And that's the great difference between the modern state and the ancient state. The modern state does everything that the ancient state wanted to, but it does so with this religious impotence in all that it tries to do. So again, I jump forward a little bit, 1953, in The Quest for Community, where Nisbet says, a state in the absolute sense which I have in mind claims the right to a monopoly of all force within the community, to make war, to make peace, to conscript life, to tax, to establish and disestablish property, to define crime, to define disobedience, to control education, to supervise the family, to regulate personal habits, and to censor opinions. There's nothing that this new political body, the modern state, can't do. And for someone like Nisbet, and I think this is amazing, and I'll continue here from this quote, there isn't a great distinction between a Hitler and a Stalin and a Roosevelt. They are not opposites to one another, but competitors for the same idea. And so Nisbet continues here, again, and I'm on page 92 of my version of Quest for Community. He says, the modern state claims all of these powers. And in the matter of theory, there is no real difference in the size of the claim between communists, fascists, and Democrats. And that is really throwing down the gauntlet when we think about the modern state. And I have a hard time seeing even someone like Friedrich Hayek making such a radical claim about the state. And this is where I think Nisbet, even though he's a self-professed conservative, has these very strong anarchical influences, most of which come from the great anarchist thinkers of the late 19th century. And Luke has dealt with this some in his own very good, most recent book. Certainly he's looked at these connections, but definitely Nisbet has this kind of anarchical streak to what he's trying to do. And then we jump forward and think about all those great things that Luke gave us, that one book after another, this incredible productivity that Nisbet gives us. In 1974 and 1975, Nisbet comes out with this book, and here I have the Liberty Fund edition, The Twilight of Authority. And we see that we're not necessarily in a dark age for Nisbet, but rather we're in this twilight age in which we exist as kind of an eternal dusk. And I would, again, bring us back to someone like Ray Bradbury. And here we are in late October. This very much has the feel of the October country. And right after the scandal of Watergate, our evacuation from Saigon, which was a huge national humiliation, the energy crisis and immense inflation of the 1970s, Nisbet writes, periodically in Western history, twilight ages make their appearance. Processes of decline and erosion of institutions are more evident than those of genesis and development. Something like a vacuum obtains in the moral order for large numbers of people. Human loyalties, uprooted from accustomed soil, can be seen tumbling across the landscape with no scheme of larger purpose to fix them. Individualism reveals itself less as achievement and enterprise than as egoism and mere performance. Retreat from the major to the minor, from the noble to the trivial, the communal to the personal, and from the objective to the subjective is commonplace. There is widely expressed sense of degradation of values and the corruption of culture. This is the sense of estrangement, and that estrangement from community is strong. Accompanying the decline of institutions and the decay of values in such ages is the cultivation of power that becomes increasingly military or paramilitary in shape. Such power exists in almost exact proportion to the decline of traditional social and moral authority. Representative and liberal institutions of government slip into patterns ever more imperial in character. And again, without being political here, just think about Biden abolishing student debt very recently. This was a move that was worthy of Justinian in the Roman Empire. It was a very imperial move on the part of our executive. Military symbols and constraints loom where civil values reign before. The centralization and increasingly individualization of power is matched in the social and cultural spheres by a combined hedonism and egalitarianism, each in its way a reflection of the destructive impact of power on the hierarchy that is native to the social bond, and over everything hangs the specter of war. So that's 1974 and 1975 for Nisbet, but that could easily be 2022. And here, I think, as Luke said, Nisbet has the role of prophet, I think, very nicely. And my last quotation today, as we think about Nisbet in the state, comes from his lectures from the late 1980s as he published them in The Present Age, Progress and Anarchy in Modern America. These are from his NEH lectures. He says, moralists from the right, blinded by their private picture of world communism, fail to see the undying persistence in the world of the nation state, be it capitalist or communist. Nationalism has spawned more wars than religion, and communism is a latter-day religion, ever has or ever will. And all the while, Stalin was blending, rending, torturing, terrorizing, always shaping Russia into an aggressive military nation. With Marxism, Leninism, its established religion, our right-wing moralistic ideologists in this country were ever seeing stereotypes, pictures in their heads of the defunct Trotskyist dream of Russia, not a nation, but instead a vast spiritual force leading all mankind to perdition. Now, again, very strong language from Nisbet as he's thinking about the political sphere, but there he identifies it's not ideology, as someone like Russell Kirk would say in his very conservative critique of the modern world, but actual nationalism and the desire to increase the role of the political sphere and of the nation state that endangers us greatly. So let me just finish with this. Nisbet was also very much an optimist in certain ways. So even though I've given you here Nisbet as critic of the state, he was also an optimist, and he believed very strongly that there was the possibility of redemption through our little platoons. He saw this specifically through the great work of Edmund Burke, and he saw this through Alexis de Tocqueville, that we, especially as Americans, always have this ability to associate with one another. And as long as we maintain that right to associate, and if we keep creating the institutions that the right to association allows, we can succeed in defeating the military Leviathan. But it will take a lot of work, and Leviathan seems to be winning at this point.
Great. Thank you, Brad. And now we will have Sam finish out the presentations, and after that we can go into a Q&A.
Thanks, John, and thanks also to Luke and Brad for their remarks before me. So I'm going to talk about Nisbet's diagnosis of the academy, which is the institution, as Luke described, where he spent the bulk of his career, in which probably he knew best, at least as an insider rather than only as a scholar. And as I'm going to describe, Nisbet's diagnosis of the university is quite different from many of the other criticisms that have been advanced by conservatives, both in his time and in ours. And in particular, it's a contrast to the criticism of the modern academy associated with figures like Alan Bloom and so-called neoconservatives of the 1980s. And it really begins, I think, with a film that many of you may remember, perhaps a few are too old. I think it's more likely that some of you will be too young. The greatest American campus movie ever made, which is Animal House. And if you've seen Animal House, you may recall that the motto of the fictional college where the story is set is "Knowledge is good." This is played as a joke because, of course, if knowledge is not good, what else would a college be for? And of course, the joke, as it's revealed through the film, is that the students and even the faculty are not particularly interested in knowledge. There are a lot of other things that are far more appealing to them. But it's a joke that works because it has a serious point. The underlying premise of the university and higher education is that knowledge is good. And this is what Nisbet means when he refers in a book of that title to the academic dogma. The fundamental academic dogma or principle of the academy is that knowledge is good. But Nisbet argues that dogma or principle is threatened. It has been subject to what he calls degradation for decades and perhaps centuries, but the threat had become particularly acute in his view around the middle of the 20th century. And what happened, Nisbet argues, is not that the academic dogma was abandoned outright. Universities still claimed to be devoted to the pursuit of truth, but rather universities added to their fundamental principle a whole range of other responsibilities and goals, including producing useful technology, providing economic development, encouraging social mobility, cultivating the emotional growth of students, providing sports entertainment, making good citizens, and on and on and on. And this is a phenomenon that Clark Kerr, who was Nisbet's nominal boss, he served in the 50s and 60s as president of the University of California system, while Nisbet himself was serving as a dean. Kerr described this as the multiversity, as opposed to the university, an institution devoted to many purposes rather than simply one. But where Kerr was optimistic that these many purposes could be successfully balanced and managed, Nisbet was far more pessimistic. Now, it's important to emphasize that Nisbet's argument here is not that these other things that universities are called upon to do are necessarily bad or unimportant. On the contrary, he recognizes that these are mostly valuable things. He even liked sports and wrote in his memoirs of Berkeley in the 1930s some very moving accounts of his support for the Cal football teams of that period. He emphasizes that what he liked was Iron Man football, with the same players playing both offense and defense. He thought having separate offensive and defensive teams was itself a kind of degradation. But nevertheless, Nisbet argues that it is very, very difficult for any institution to pursue so many goals at one time. And the result is that the university is not particularly effective at any of them, which encourages the sense of drift or twilight, as Brad had called it, which he perceived setting over the academy as early as the 1970s. Now, again, a qualification or caveat is in order. Nisbet is not claiming that this expansive tendency is altogether new. He recognizes that in practice, universities have always balanced some range of purposes. And from a very early stage in the foundation of Western universities, the pursuit of truth was balanced with a role training people for the so-called learned professions, law, medicine, and ministry, historically. And a little bit later, in the 19th century, universities also acquired important functions, selecting and grooming members of the social and political elite. So he's not naively claiming that universities were ever devoted to knowledge simply for its own sake. But he argues that there's a big shift in the middle of the 20th century, and not coincidentally, and Brad has already alluded to this argument, for Nisbet it's associated with war, specifically with the Second World War. Before that time, particularly in the United States, higher education really had minimal connection to government. It's true that state universities, like the universities of California, did receive a certain amount of funding, but it was a very small line item in state budgets, certainly compared to the funding that higher education receives today. But with the mobilization of the institutions of civil society as well as the economy for wartime purposes, government, and especially the federal government or the national government rather than the state governments, becomes the main funding source for higher education and also the central consumer of the various goods that universities provide. And that means that for Nisbet, in contrast to some of his contemporaries, what is now regarded as the mid-century golden age of American higher education, when the GI Bill was making it possible for more and more Americans to attend college, when federal funding, especially for the natural sciences, when it was at its peak, and so on, Nisbet really sees this as a period of decay. Yes, it led to some great achievements of scholarship, but it was a corruption of the institution, which was transformed from an autonomous descendant of the medieval monastery into a nationalized vehicle for various social, political, and again, remember the World War II and Cold War context, military goals. Nisbet characterizes this change in the middle of the 20th century as a reformation. Not so much, I think, because of its spiritual qualities, but because he wants to emphasize the similarity to the reconstruction of Western Christianity, which involved the seizure or co-optation of autonomous religious institutions by the state. And to return to the theme that I began with, this is really a very different diagnosis to the more familiar neoconservative critique, according to which universities went off the rails a couple of decades later, more or less in the late 1960s. Nisbet was as bitter a critic of the New Left as anyone else, although ironically, many of the leading figures in the New Left had read The Quest for Community and were inspired by Nisbet's criticism of the national state and of impersonal bureaucratic institutions, even though they applied those insights in different ways. But Nisbet believed that an emphasis on the ideological qualities of the New Left lacked an explanation of why universities were so vulnerable to disruption and co-optation. The problem, in his view, is not that students weren't reading enough Plato or Aristotle, or that they hadn't received the right educational formation. The problem was that they had already abandoned their original principle or their fundamental dogma and embraced the principle of social utility. And in that sense, struggles between Cold War liberals and the New Left were really just arguments about the right non-academic goals to pursue, but not arguments about whether non-academic goals were decisive. In other words, everyone agreed that the purpose of the university was to serve society in some grand sense, but they had different views of how precisely to accomplish that. Again, for Nisbet, ideology is not the key factor here. he draws our attention to changing institutional and professional incentives and the changing role of government funding. Through the middle of the 20th century, professional rewards are shifted from teaching to independent research, and from departmental or disciplinary scholarship to the independent lab or research project, which often received direct government funding. And one result of this was that academics began to enjoy much greater mobility between institutions. Rather than spending their careers in one place, they could move from one university to another. And all of this had to be overseen by a growing administration that was devoted to moving the money around, accounting for it, and making sure that all rules were obeyed. So the result for Nisbet is that academics no longer regard themselves as colleagues in the literal sense, equal members of a self-governing body, again, descended from the medieval monastery. That's where the language of the college or collegium comes from. Instead, they became effectively employees of a major corporation. And we see today how major corporations are susceptible to pressure by outside activists. I think that would not surprise Nisbet in the slightest, and he thought something very similar had happened in universities. You can see the difference between what Nisbet is saying and the more familiar diagnosis in the introduction to the reprint in the early 2000s of The Degradation of the Academic Dogma. If you happen to buy the book, that's probably the one that you will find. The intro is by the late historian Gertrude Himmelfarb. And you can see in the introduction how Himmelfarb is trying to assimilate Nisbet into the more familiar conservative cultural criticism. And what she says is, well, there was this first Reformation around World War II, but that was then followed by a second Reformation in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But I think Nisbet's response, and I'll conclude here so we have some time for discussion, is that these were really aspects of the same process and can't easily be separated. Himmelfarb and many of her contemporaries seem to have assumed that the Academy of, say, 1960 was a stable equilibrium. And if it had not been for the interference of a small band of ideological activists, those conditions would have continued forever. But for Nisbet, and again, I think this is reflected in Animal House, that was very far from the case. The academic dogma was already subject to degradation. Academic institutions were already adrift. And this is why the much more dramatic transformation of later decades was possible.
Thanks so much, Sam. Of course, I think it's a fantastic way to end our presentations for a National Association of Scholars webinar to talk about higher education. Those are questions and ideas that are very close to the kind of work that I do. So again, audience, if you have questions, the Q&A box is open, but I have plenty of my own questions that I'm very eager to get into. So I'll go ahead and start. I'm going to direct my questions to individual panelists, but panelists, if you have comments to add, please do. So I want to start with Luke. And my question is, do you think that there is a connection between Nisbet's critique of developmentalism and his understanding of community and the state and the conflict between the two?
Yeah. So one thing he sees is a great bolster to the power of the state is precisely by casting it in developmentalist terms. So we can look at societies from long ago. They were kinship based, and then maybe they had a weak state, and the state grows and kind of aggregates power, and it can be seen as an outgrowth of those earlier institutions, or it's described in this way. But that gives the state this sense of historical inevitability, to use Augustine's term. So the power of the state is not just a fact of contemporary society or 20th century society or modern society. It's an inevitable fact. This was just going to happen. The state was going to grow. It was going to accrue the functions of all of these other institutions. It kind of, you can see it as the capstone. And so it's just can be described in this way, and this gives it incredible strength that really bolsters its case. So if you say something like, well, gosh, we should have families that are a lot stronger. We should have local communities that have more authority. That sounds, to use a term that's often used to describe that, as backwards, because you're going back in time to an earlier time. We remember inevitability and irreversible change. So as the state grows in power, we can't go back. We can't give authority back to those institutions. We can't give function back to those institutions. So it gives the kind of the triumph of the state over all those institutions a sense of inevitability, kind of a hopelessness for its opponents, and kind of a triumphalist view for its advocate. So he sees a relationship. So that understanding of developmentalism very much kind of bolsters the political theory of the state with a capital S.
I would just add to that that Nisbet is developing these ideas in the heyday of what was called modernization theory, which held that there was one direction of history, culminating in the modern state, especially in its more nationalized and bureaucratized form, and eventually not only states in different parts of the world and produced by different cultures, but also the West and the East, or the communist and capitalist states, would converge on one model. And Clark Kerr, whom I mentioned a few moments ago, was one of the advocates of this idea. So I think it's in some ways. It was some ways even more counterintuitive at the time than it is now. And that goes to Brad's point that Nisbet really is quite prophetic, and seems, if not to foresee specifically, then to be aware of tendencies that are now evident much more effectively than some of his contemporaries on both the right and the left.
Okay, one audience member asks a question that I think is interesting. So when I read about Nisbet, his ideas seem quite relevant to kind of the contemporary right in a whole host of ways, but I think that he is to some extent a little underemphasized as a thinker, and especially as a thinker who was so productive in his time. So one audience member just asked, who are the contemporary heirs of Nisbet, aside from our distinguished panelists? And maybe I'll expand on that a little bit. Where do you see Nisbet's ideas having influence over kind of political discussions or academic discussions today?
Yeah, so Yuval Levin, some of his work kind of is in a Nisbetian vein. John DiIulio at the University of Pennsylvania is kind of a very much self-consciously in Nisbet's vein. Some things kind of, if you kind of think broadly in the last few decades, interestingly enough, when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was being worked on in the 1990s, some of its academic architects were discussing in the halls of Congress what Nisbet might think about it. So he has kind of influence in that sort of way. I've brought him to bear on the concept of freedom of association and the Supreme Court case law there in my own work. So he has, I'd say he has some errors in that way. Not as many as I'd like.
Brad and Sam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, Luke, remind us again about the title of your book. It's an excellent book. I'm just forgetting the title right now.
Why Associations Matter.
Right. I mean, that I would say is, I mean, very much, absolutely a Nisbetian book in every way. But I think, unfortunately, especially on the right, Nisbet has been almost largely forgotten. And that really started, it's amazing. I think he got identified with the neocons in the late 1980s. Because of his connections with the NEH, but also earlier because of some of his work for commentary. And I think a lot of the more traditionalist conservatives really kind of have unfortunately, read Nisbet out of the conservative movement in the 1990s. And I don't think he's fully recovered. He's one of those figures, even Kirk, who never intentionally made disciples, has disciples. Nisbet really, aside from Robert Perrin, really doesn't have that many students who have followed through on his work. And that's unfortunate. But I think that's true with a lot of people on the right. Conservatism, by its very nature and its individualism, doesn't lend itself, ironically, to continuity over time. There are more people who are definitely followers of de Tocqueville and of Burke, and therefore I think have a lot in common with Nisbet, but there aren't direct followers of Nisbet other than I think Luke and a couple of other people.
So Brad, I wanted to ask you another question that I had, which is, you talk a lot about how Nisbet's conception of the state is as radical as some of these more radical libertarian philosophers. You mentioned Murray Rothbard. And so I'm wondering, how exactly do you distinguish Nisbet from a libertarian? Obviously, that's not the legacy that I think anyone associates him with. Where do you see that difference coming in?
Yeah, so, he's very interesting because he's a Burkean and he's a Tocquevillian. And I think that's pretty clear when we look at the trajectory, not only of the influences on him, but where he takes his own scholarship. But one of the figures that he mentions that we often ignore in our present day, he loved Hilaire Belloc, Chesterton's best friend. Hilaire Belloc had written in 1912 a book called The Servile State, which Nisbet encountered in 1936, and it radically changed his worldview. He had gone from being kind of a moderate New Dealer to being extremely anti-statist after reading Belloc's work. And then he also encountered, roughly about 4 or 5 years later, he encountered the work of Albert J. Nock, who was a pretty prominent anarchist in the first half of the 20th century. So I think that led him back to some of the great works of the late 19th century and the anarchists there. And it's hard, you think about someone like Russell Kirk or Leo Strauss, and you would never, ever put anarchy in with either of those figures at all. But with Nisbet, there is an element of that because I think he's so influenced by these various thinkers. So again, I think he's a conservative, and we would put him in the conservative camp. But there's no doubt that he was deeply influenced by these late 19th and early 20th century anarchists who had really rejected, I think, especially the history of classical liberalism. And much like, I think in a modern day, someone like Patrick Deneen has rejected that classical liberalism. I think Nisbet would be somewhat comfortable with that, and yet Nisbet would be far more anti-statist than someone like Deneen is.
Yeah, I think Nisbet's disagreement with libertarians has less to do with his assessment of the state than his conception of the role of individuals. Mm-hmm. He argued that libertarians, even though they were theoretically opposed to the state, appealed to an unconnected, freely choosing individual that was actually dependent on the state. And Deneen has given a version of that argument, as have several others. Nisbet's preference was for what he called a laissez-faire of groups. So the laissez-faire part is compatible with certain forms of liberalism or even near anarchism. The state should leave people alone. But the object of laissez-faire for Nisbet was not the individual, but rather institutions and associations that could be quite hierarchical and anti-individualistic internally. So that's where I think the disagreement to at least some libertarians emerges. Whether that's true of Rothbard in particular, I don't know. But for Nisbet, libertarians are dependent on the state, or the libertarian moral individualism of libertarianism is dependent on the state in the way that his kind of pluralism was not, or so he believed.
I think that's a very fair statement, Sam. And I'm not a Rothbard scholar either, and I was actually just using him because I was trying to think of the most radical libertarian I knew. Right. So that's why I threw him in there.
Well, but there's an interesting comparison between them. You know, if you think of Rothbard's partial defense of the mafia as a form of social organization, and although Nisbet was by no means an admirer of organized crime, you know, there is a point of overlap there, that what authority looks like without the modern state is very different to our assumption of equal, freely choosing individuals. And that works, I think, for the criticism of developmentalism that Luke talked about too. So there's a famous book, again, very important for Nisbet's generation of intellectuals, by the sociologist Ed Banfield, The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. It's a sociological account of Southern Italy, where the state is very weak. And as the title suggests, it's based on this developmental model. It's a backward society. So that's the way it used to be, but you're moving, or should be moving, toward the modern state. And I think Nisbet's response is, you say that's backward, but why? It's a form of order that has advantages and disadvantages like any other, but it's not inherently prior in history or in moral dignity to the modern state-based order.
Well, while we're talking about Nisbet's connection to political traditions that he might not actually be a part of, Sam, one of your comments made me think of a quote that I found in the New York Times obituary for Nisbet, and that where they say that the quest for community became something of a cult classic among the countercultural radicals of the 50s and 60s. So clearly, Nisbet is a useful thinker for a wide variety of political, stripes. But given that, what exactly is how exactly do you explain that? What in the quest for community would appeal to people on that side of the political spectrum?
The quest for community, on the one hand, can be associated, as Brad did, with the other great conservative works of 1953, including books by Kirk and Strauss, among others. I think Clinton Rossiter also published the American Political Tradition book in that year. But another way that you can understand the status of the quest for community is as a counterpart to books like William White's The Organization Man, which was published, I think, 2 years later, I think 1955, but it's close. It's closely contemporary. And these were books that were very popular and widely circulated and discussed, that argued that modern society, and especially modern America, had become bureaucratic, had become mediocre, had been subjugated by these big impersonal institutions, and called for a revival of spontaneity, of creativity, of individuality, if not moral individualism necessarily. That was very appealing to a lot of people, and played a role in the emergence of what would become in the 1960s the counterculture. Nisbet couldn't fully accept that because, again, I think he was very suspicious of the emphasis on the individual and the assumption that the alternatives to bureaucratic institutions would be somehow even more egalitarian and fair by liberal standards. He thought the opposite was likely to be true. But clearly, he shared the sense that was widespread around the middle of the 1950s that something really vital and important was being squeezed out of modern life in general and American life in particular. And what would become the New Left was one response to that perception, or one way of developing that idea.
John, can I jump in on this too?
Yeah,
I love what Sam just said, and I would throw in, it's very interesting if you look at the development of science fiction in the 1950s as well, not just with Bradbury, I mentioned earlier, but Arthur Bester's Demolished Man, and then later Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano. And even in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings with the Scouring of the Shire, you've got this whole fear about what an organized community can do. And it's very strong in that form of literature, which I think all kinds of it all adds up to help the counterculture in the 1960s, or at least precipitated.
And Tolkien is another example of that. I mean, Tolkien was not a hippie by any means,
and Daily Mass Catholic,
and yet the Lord of the Rings and his imaginative world became an inspiration to people whom I think he would have found very alien and disturbing in certain ways, but found in him a protest, an imaginative alternative to standardization, to bureaucratization, to the increasing uniformity and commercialism of modern life. And again, Nisbet belongs in that genre, even if he drew different political conclusions.
I also think that, at least for me, one of the most interesting things about the early conservative movement is how many ties it did have to the leftists of the time, like C. Wright Mills and other figures, because there was this huge fear, especially you see this in Kirk, you see it in Nisbet as well, this absolutely huge fear of conformity in the late 1940s and early 1950s. That really is, I mean, it really does shape early conservatism to a great extent.
So this makes me think that a question from an audience member is maybe appropriate here. One audience member asks, can the sort of communitarian tradition be one place where we can locate Nisbet's enduring influence? Because it seems like the communitarian tradition in some ways is a response to that bureaucratization, standardization that Nisbet and people on the radical mid-century left were responding to.
Sam, go ahead on that one.
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction in the communitarian tradition. So clearly, Nisbet belongs to the tradition, if not the school, of communitarian pluralists or pluralist communitarians. I mean, you can put the words together in different orders. And as we've been discussing, I mean, he really believed that it was only in smaller, more independent, and more personalized associations that human beings can find the order and meaning that we seek. So in that sense, he's a communitarian. But he was actually very critical of the academic communitarians of the 1980s because he thought they were ultimately statists. He thought that people like Robert Bellah, to mention probably the most prominent example, wanted a community at the level of the nation state. They wanted an American community of a kind that he just didn't think was possible. So his criticism of Bella and the other 1980s communitarians is that they were unwilling to accept the conclusions of their own insight, which was that a communitarian society would be much more fractured and contentious and it's a pejorative, but balkanized, these sort of separate worlds and institutions that didn't have a lot to do with each other, rather than creating this consensual national community in which everyone broadly agrees on shared ideals, and there's a high degree of solidarity from New York to California with everything in between. For Nisbet, that's not community. That's the opposite of community.
So an audience member asks, they write that the contemporary left critiques of the university often invoke the idea that the university has become corporatized, it has a consumer model. So they ask, how would you square that or juxtapose that with the critique that Nisbet offers?
Well, I think that diagnosis is not incompatible with Nisbet's account, although it's true that Nisbet is thinking about a period in which there's a lot more direct funding from the national government, often for national security purposes. We've moved into a slightly different model now, where we subsidize demand, in effect, and that promotes a consumer mentality. I'm paying. What are you doing for me? But I think Nisbet would share the view that is a corruption of the university and a degradation of the academic dogma. Where he would disagree is the attempt to replace the consumer university or the market university with social justice or equity, which in his view is just another substitution of an alien principle and an alien purpose. But that, I think, reflects something we've already been discussing, which is that Nisbet does not fit neatly into instinctive ideological categories, at least those that are instinctive to us today, and his views are very much at odds with at least elements of the right as well as the left.
Sam, why do you think that Nisbet was so anti-great books? Hey, in Degradation of Academic Dogma, he goes after Hutchins, and he does that. Yeah. I mean, where do you think that's coming from?
I think I don't think he was anti-great books in lowercase letters.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the things one of the complaints that he advances there and elsewhere is that it used to be not only required for majors like sociology, his own discipline, but also others, that you begin with text-based historical instruction in the greats of the field. And he lamented that in his day at Berkeley, people like Taggart taught this introductory course and really looked forward to it. But in the modern bureaucratized university, what you want is a course release so you can go off and do your own research, and you don't have to bother with introductory instruction for undergraduates. So in that sense, I don't think he was opposed to great books. He wanted to and did teach Burke and Tocqueville and Durkheim and others. What I think he worried about was a kind of ossified great books curriculum in which there are 15 or 20 titles that don't change and that stop roughly in 1800. And he thought that not only cut off too much thought that was genuinely great and important, but also that it constrained academic freedom. And that instructors should be free to decide for themselves what books were great and what books were appropriate for their courses. So I don't think it was an objection to the idea of great books. It was an objection to a centralized and bureaucratic, capital letters, great books curriculum.
Okay,
which he associated with people like Hutchins.
That's fair. And that reminds me of someone like Christopher Dawson, who loves the liberal arts and loves the greats, but thought that the Great Books programs were Gnostic in some way because they did create this kind of closed category. So it sounds like that's where we would put Nisbet, maybe a little less religiously, but
yeah, I think for slightly different reasons, reaching a similar conclusion. And again, if you look at the old University of Chicago program, but even Great Books programs today, they tend to neglect many of the thinkers and texts that Nisbet thought were quite important.
Right. Thanks.
And where does this concept of academic dogma, kind of a very narrow vision for the university that is devoted singularly to the idea of the pursuit of truth, where does that fit in with his broader picture of society? It almost sounds like he's proposing something very radical by saying that should be kind of the ideal for the university, which I think, I agree with that. I think that perhaps we need to radically rethink what the modern university is, but at the very least, the university serves so many roles now, and it did in his time, that it seems like to peel back those roles and have it focus on the pursuit of truth in this very narrow sense, that requires a vision for how the university would fit into a broader society that's robust. And so I'm curious what that looks like for Nisbet.
Well, for Nisbet, I think it means that again, it's not that these other functions are bad or irrelevant. It's just that you don't want to pile them all into one institution, and maybe especially not into universities. So I think what the sort of the goal is, although the means are sometimes hard to see, is to disaggregate some of those functions. Job training is important, but it's not clear that universities need to be the ones to provide it. Sports are good. Nisbet was a sports fan, but again, universities don't have to be the vehicle for that. So I think, at least as a direction, Nisbet's suggestion is we need to look for ways to sort of peel away some of these other functions, not so that they disappear entirely, but so that they can be taken over by institutions that are more narrowly focused on those activities, and as a result, will probably do a better job.
Yeah, it seems like this is at least for someone like me, this is a very big kind of hot button issue. Not just in university policy, but in American politics today, the way that the universities have been captured or devoted to a cause that seems very different than this quasi-monastic vision that Nisbet seems to appreciate. So I guess I'm curious what you think his work can kind of whether his work can kind of refocus the way that people talk about the university and the way that the universities now strive, especially for things like social justice. How can Nisbet's work kind of refocus that discussion?
Well, I think Nisbet provides inspiration and a set of arguments to say that's just not what these institutions are for. That's really the implication. That's not what universities are for. That doesn't mean that these other purposes and goals, again, are bad or to be dismissed, but universities are not the appropriate vehicle for all of this other stuff. And although for obvious reasons, it's easy to focus on the pursuit of social justice or equity, because that really has become the public face of universities. But if you look at their balance sheets, I mean, if you look at the numbers, the money, the employees, many universities today are hospital systems with football teams. You know, the liberal arts departments that everyone gets so upset about are a minor line item. And what I think Nisbet is reminding us is that's not good either. That too represents a degradation of the academic dogma or drift, and it's not good enough simply to resist the social justice redirection of the university. You also have to be willing to say it's not a hospital system, it's not a football team. If universities are to be successful, they need to return not entirely and without exceptions, which is impossible, but recover a sense of a distinctive purpose that only they can fulfill.
I think it's also worth remembering that Nisbet is not just theoretical about this. He was a dean at UC Riverside for many years, from about 1953 up until about 1970, had played an intimate role there in the creation of that university and its development.
Yeah, that's something I didn't know, which is really interesting because, there aren't that many people in higher education administration these days who are also able to be kind of high level, high caliber scholars. So it's quite impressive. So I want to finish out with maybe just a broad level question. Well, actually, with two things. First, I want to give both of the speakers who are here, unfortunately, Luke had to step out, but both of the speakers who are here, a chance to give a closing thought on the discussion and on Nisbet. And then if you have any particular work of Nisbet that you think is worth highlighting, please mention those. I think it's helpful to have recommendations, especially with a thinker like Nisbet, whose corpus is so large, and whose work is really, I think, under discussed, despite clearly having valuable contributions. So let me go ahead and start with you, Brad.
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks again to NAS and to Sam and to Luke for doing all of this, and Marina. Really, really appreciate this discussion. It's funny, I had a class right before I'm teaching a course on Lewis and Tolkien. So Sam, they had just gotten to Mordor. So I had to do this kind of whiplash. It's like, wait a minute. I'm not in Mordor anymore. I actually get to discuss a good guy here.
No, so we're all still in Mordor.
Yeah, that's true. We're at least on the edges. For me, I love Nisbet, and I go back to him over and over again. And in my home office, I've got a shelf of all of Nisbet's works, and I keep them as pristine as possible. I mean, I write in them, but I keep the shelf as in place as possible. And I think part of the reason I like Nisbet, he's so rational about so many things. I love Kirk, but Kirk's so romantic. Nisbet is so rational about the way he approaches the world. And I love that he takes Burke so seriously. I love that he takes de Tocqueville so seriously. So you're always, whenever you read Nisbet, you're really reading the best of Western civilization because of those influences on him. But I would say if there's a book that people in the audience probably haven't read but should read, and it's easily available because Liberty Fund publishes it, it is this one I quoted from, Twilight of Authority. It's a little bit rooted in the mid-1970s because it is responding to the disasters in Vietnam and Cambodia, and then to Watergate and the inflation and everything that's going on around the Nixon administration. And properly, Nisbet despised Nixon and saw him as the great example of everything that could go wrong in the modern nation state, and saw that corruption that was there. But I think one of the great things about Nisbet, especially in this book, Twilight of Authority, it's not apocalyptic. I think a lot of people at the time are thinking the end of the world is coming. Nisbet says, why does it have to be the end of the world? Why can't we just be in another dark age? And we may come out of it at some point. And I find that refreshing. I find it refreshing that it doesn't have to be an end of the world argument, but instead just looks at the rise, kind of plebeian cycles of history. that we have these ways of rising and of falling, and maybe both things are going on at the same time. And I'm reminded very much of the work of Eric Voegelin, especially in the new science of politics. It's perfectly possible that we're technologically advancing as we're morally declining. And those are the kinds of things that Nisbet really deals with beautifully in The Twilight of Authority. It is one of his more polemical books. It's not meant to be an academic book. It's meant to be a polemic. But Nisbet is really good when he's polemical, in large part because he is so rational. And he doesn't become too hyperbolic about all kinds of things, but really lays things out. So I find I like The Present Age as well, his Jefferson lectures from the late 1980s, but it starts getting into more of the kind of apocalyptic vision. And I think that in his younger stage, when he wrote The Twilight of Authority, there was just a greater sense of maturity to that work. So I really do recommend that to your audience, to this audience.
Yeah, Brad says that these problems are specific or linked to the particular events of the 1970s, but it all sounds very familiar. Inflation, foreign policy, humiliation, the collapse of order at home. I think that moment, including deep political corruption, feels very similar to our own. So The Twilight of Authority is probably a good place to go. All of that said, and I've been talking about the degradation of the academic dogma, which I do recommend, and I think is really the most insightful of the conservative criticisms of academia of the last 50 or 60 years, precisely because Nisbet is an insider and he looks at the institutional and structural factors as well as the intellectual ones. That said, The Quest for Community really is a modern classic. And if you are interested in Nisbet and haven't read it, that remains the place to start, if not the place to finish.
And that is a great place to finish our discussion for today. So thank you once again to our panelists, Brad and Samuel.
Thank you, John.
I want to mention before we conclude that this is a part of a series, and it's a part of a series where I really am trying to highlight thinkers who have been influential on the right and who may be less acknowledged than they should be, like Robert Nisbet. So in the future, we're going to have webinars on people like Michael Oakeshott, Philip Rieff, Wendell Berry, thinkers who some of whom are rightly acknowledged to be a part of the conservative canon, but some of whom are also very influential on the right, and not to mention just in modern political discussions, even though they might not necessarily be a part of that canon. So if you enjoyed what you saw today, please consider going to nas.org and just checking out the upcoming webinars that we have, because it's really this is the kind of discussion that we're hoping to generate today. And Sam and Brad, this was an excellent discussion, so I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Sam.
And thanks to everyone watching.